No one will complete the barrier on the Mexican border. No one wants to commit military power to defend this country. We'll defend Ukraine and Poland, but we won't defend America. What's wrong with that? We know historically the Ukrainians have always been good fighters. They didn't have to go to war to prove it, but they've proven it once again. The problem is, for what? What are they fighting for at this point? Virtually everything of any value in Ukraine is under Russian control. In other words, this is similar to an enemy that came into the United States and controlled the entire East Coast and then sat there. That's what the Russians have done. In other words, they've captured the scientific industrial base, the coal mines, the iron ore, the rare earths, the natural gas, the oil, everything. They're sitting on it. And that's not surprising because the people that live in those areas are overwhelmingly Russians. And they speak Russian, so they're very happy to have the Russians there. But having captured that, Ukraine is left with a large agrarian sector, but almost nothing else, which means it now depends very heavily on anything that we manufacture or the Europeans manufacture. And the Europeans are effectively out of gear. They've sent most of what they had to send. The German defense minister recently said Germany really can't afford to send any more than it already has and what is promised, because if we do, we'll be defenseless. You know, I mentioned the other day to someone that people don't realize just how bad things are in NATO. The Polish army today could probably conquer Germany in a week because the Germans just have no military power to speak of to stop them. Now, I'm not saying that's going to happen, but I think that gives everybody an appreciation for just how weak Germany is. Germany has prospered with all this cheap natural gas and oil from Russia for decades, but it has also neglected its own military establishment to the point where it's almost defenseless. When you switch to France, as a good friend of mine who's a retired general in the French army says repeatedly, Douglas, the only thing the French army is prepared to do is go on safari in North Africa. In other words, the rest of the force is designed for all of this low-intensity conflict nonsense that we've been wasting time on for the past 25 or 30 years, ever since Desert Storm. So the bottom line is, yes, the Ukrainians are in a very, very bad situation. It's not going to improve dramatically, but they're going to dig in subsequent locations and try to defend against what is coming in the spring. But I don't think we're going to see much in the way of a major Ukrainian counterattack. They were talking about a counteroffensive in the springtime. I don't think we're going to see much of that. We may see some localized attacks, but not much more.
Are they just out of people or out of weapons or just?
I would say all of the above, David, all of the above. When you look at the personnel side, we see in many, many units that have been reduced in strength from 100% down to 50% or 40% or 30%. The replacements are overwhelmingly boys, 15, 16, 17, some women, and men age 40 to 60. And they're not bad people. They only have perhaps 3 weeks of preparation or training, and they're essentially sent in to fill out these units. And the Russians refer to them openly as cannon fodder. In other words, they're not very capable. There are a few special units left with hardcore professional soldiers in them, but the majority no longer have those. The majority are very weakly populated with relatively new recruits who cannot be expected to endure the hardships that their predecessors did.
So, I mean, you said earlier, Bakhmut, there's an estimated 200,000 Ukrainians have died?
Not in Bakhmut, but over 200,000 Ukrainians have died in this war, Ukrainian soldiers. It's probably much higher. I've seen estimates of 257,000. I mean, we don't know with absolute certainty, but people are over there in the hospitals and going to the grave sites, and they're able to identify large numbers of people. That's how we find out the truth, because the Ukrainian government isn't going to tell you they've taken these sorts of losses. I mean, we're in a war where the Ukrainians substitute lies for the truth. So they say, oh, no, the Russians have taken all these horrendous casualties. That's not true. We think the Russians have had about 80,000 casualties, probably 25,000 killed at the moment. And that's simply because they have this preponderance in missiles, rockets, and artillery. And 75% of the casualties inflicted on the Ukrainians come from artillery, rockets, and missiles and drones. That's where the majority of casualties come from. They're not coming from tanks and armored fighting vehicles. They're not even coming from soldiers shooting at each other. Most of it is standoff attack. In other words, long range, medium range strike.
I see. When I look at this story in the Washington Post, I mean, it's pretty concerning about the safety that we're losing here in this country. It says, the headline is, in race to arm Ukraine, U.S. faces cracks in its manufacturing might. This is by Missy Ryan. And it's surprisingly critical of it has a tone of kind of critiquing some of the facts on the ground there. That's surprising to me because I typically think of the Washington Post as pretty in favor of the D.C. establishment line on things. But it says here, research conducted by the Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS, shows the current output of American factories may be insufficient to prevent the depletion of stockpiles of key items the United States is providing Ukraine. Even at accelerated production rates, it is likely to take at least several years to recover the inventory of Javelin anti-tank missiles, Stinger surface-to-air missiles, and other in-demand items.
Yes. No, I think that's a very, very accurate article. And there are certain things that your viewer or your listeners need to understand. This year, we're closing in on almost $1 trillion for defense, 850 billion plus. We haven't even addressed the amount of money that goes into the intelligence systems and the black budget, which constitute billions of dollars. We have been spending a lot of money on defense. No one really knows where all the money goes. Every time we try to audit the Department of Defense, we give up because we simply don't know where all the money has gone. Now we're sitting around and we're discovering that the industrial base, which is a critical feature of national defense, has been languishing, has been allowed to rot, has been allowed to diminish in terms of its capabilities. And people are going to say, well, what happened? Well, if you start asking the generals and the admirals if they can even give you a coherent answer, they're probably going to tell you, well, we don't really look into those matters. We just look into the major weapon systems and ships, aircraft, vehicles, and so forth, which is also true for Congress, because most of the immediate benefit to defense spending for people on the Hill or for the individuals who are invested in defense comes from the big ticket items, new ships, new tanks, new this, new that. No one is looking at the potential for a real war. Remember that since 2001, we've been chasing people in bed sheets with AK-47s and sandals, occasionally some command-detonated mines. You're not talking about serious opponents with armies and air forces, which is what we're dealing with right now in Ukraine and Russia. As a consequence, we're not prepared, and we have no surge capacity. We used to have the ability to say, all right, we're producing, say, 10 aircraft a month. We need to produce 50, and we could ramp up and do that. We can't do that right now. And most of the weapon systems that we want to rapidly ramp up and produce in greater quantities are complex, like these missiles. You just don't start producing Javelin missiles on an assembly line. You've got lots of people who are physically assembling the components to make these precision-guided weapons work. So we can't keep up. On the other hand, over the last decade or two, the Russians have focused their attention once again on their industrial base and their ability to rapidly ramp up, surge, and produce vast quantities of equipment and weapons and ammunition. So now they are operating 7 days a week, 24 hours a day, turning out huge quantities of ammunition, missiles, rockets, tanks, infantry fighting vehicles, artillery systems, and so forth. We can't keep up with that. And neither, obviously, can the Ukrainians, because they're dependent on us for supply. And what I just discussed Doesn't even exist in most of Europe right now. Very few European states have much of an industrial base committed to the production of military equipment. They've given it up because the Europeans depend entirely on us for their defense.
Yeah, it doesn't look good. So we're not in a situation because of this conflict. We're basically putting ourselves in a very dangerous situation in terms of any type of attack, right? I mean, we don't have the resources. I mean, I don't know. Maybe, someone who's a military expert would say, oh, the things that we're low on, we don't really need right now. It's not an immediate thing. We have many other means of defense that are far more important that we have plenty of. So this is a false narrative to be alarmed about.
Well, we've historically relied very heavily on air power to compensate for weaknesses on the ground. Not enough troops and not enough firepower. And that's fine when you're dealing with a weak opponent. But now you're talking about an opponent who has an extensive theater, air, and missile defense system. And if we were to fly most of our aircraft against the Russians right now, we would take heavy losses. In other words, the days of flying with impunity are over. And we can't afford in most cases to lose a lot of aircraft and pilots because, frankly, we don't have that many to begin with on the ground. What you're pointing to, David, is very important.